The snow was coming down hard when the first bus tried to turn. I was standing near the entrance of the neighborhood, breath fogging the air, when the yellow bus lost traction so quietly it took a second to register what was happening. No crash. No drama. Just tires sliding, slow and helpless, until the bus drifted sideways and stopped diagonally across the only exit road. Inside, kids started crying. I could see their faces through the fogged windows. The driver gripped the wheel, frozen, radio pressed to their mouth. Parents spilled out of their houses in boots and coats thrown on over pajamas. Phones came up instinctively. Someone shouted my name. I yelled back what we already knew. The road hadn't been cleared, not once. Not after all the warnings. A parent near me said, almost in disbelief, that the HOA had blocked private snowplows to stay within budget. I called the HOA head. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. When I reached non-emergency police, they didn't argue. Snow removal on private roads was the HOA's responsibility. As I hung up, a second bus appeared at the top of the hill and stopped short, unable to come down. Parents started shouting. Someone said the kids could freeze if this dragged on. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. This was what happens when people choose rules over safety. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before that morning, before the buses and the cameras and the panic, this neighborhood was supposed to be predictable. That was the word the realtor used. Predictable winters, predictable maintenance, predictable rules. We moved here because it felt orderly, the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened, and that was the point. The HOA leaned hard into that image. Their welcome packet talked about efficiency, about being self-managed and cost-conscious, no waste. No outside management company skimming fees. Just residents overseeing their own community like responsible adults. At the time, it sounded reassuring. The only thing that ever gave me pause was the road. There was one way in and one way out. A single access road that sloped downhill sharply before flattening near the entrance. Every school morning, buses had to climb that hill, turn, and then descend it again. There was no alternate route, no emergency cutoff. If that road failed, the entire neighborhood was effectively sealed off. I mentioned it casually once, early on, and was told it had never been an issue. The first winter seemed to support that claim. Snow came, but it was handled. Not officially, not through the HOA, but informally. A handful of residents pooled money and hired a local plow driver. He cleared the hill early on school mornings and came back when storms got heavier. The HOA knew. Everyone knew. Nobody objected. It worked. Which is usually all anyone cares about. That changed after the board election the following spring. The new board leader ran on what they called financial discipline. Their emails were full of phrases like risk mitigation and policy consistency. They talked less about neighbors and more about liability exposure. Again, on paper, it sounded reasonable. But the first real action they took was to shut down the informal plow arrangement. The message came out in a clean, neutral tone. Unauthorized vendors were not permitted. All services had to be approved through proper channels, allowing residents to alter common property, even temporarily, created unacceptable legal risk. Snow clearing would be handled as needed. Parents pushed back, carefully at first. I sent an email explaining the hill and the bus route. Others followed with photos from previous winters and short notes about safety. No one was emotional. No one accused anyone of anything. We were asking for clarity. The response came days later and was brief. The board said emergency situations would be handled by the city. Residents were advised not to take independent action. That answer didn't align with reality, so I checked. The city was clear. Private roads were the HOA's responsibility. They might respond if there was an active emergency, but routine access maintenance wasn't guaranteed. I forwarded that email to the board. There was no reply. As summer passed and fall turned cold, the tone shifted further. Questions about winter planning were met with copied sections of bylaws. Requests for discussion were delayed or redirected. When someone asked at an open forum what would happen if a bus couldn't make it up the hill, the board leader said they would address concerns if and when they became actionable. It was the language that bothered me most. Everything was theoretical to them, conditional, abstract. Safety wasn't a responsibility. It was a potential future issue that didn't yet require intervention. By the time the first light snowfall arrived, people were uneasy. A neighbor asked whether they could shovel the steepest section themselves. The answer came back quickly this time. No. Any modification of common elements without approval would be considered a violation. Not clearing the road, shoveling it. Emails started getting shorter, less conversational, more formal. Warnings about fines were introduced, not aggressively, just matter-of-factly, as if enforcement were an inevitability, not a choice. Then came the notice. It was posted digitally and taped to mailboxes a few days before the storm. It stated that no unauthorized snow clearing, plowing, or treatment of HOA roads would be permitted under any circumstances. Violations would result in penalties. There were no exceptions listed, no mention of school routes, no acknowledgement of emergency access. I stood at the bottom of the hill reading it, watching the sky darken with the promise of heavy snow. The wording wasn't hostile. It didn't need to be. It was absolute. That was when I understood what we were dealing with. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't oversight. The board hadn't failed to consider the risk. They had considered it and decided control mattered more. Rules mattered more. Being technically correct mattered more than what would actually happen when winter did what winter always does. And as the storm forecast updated that night, I realized we weren't heading toward a misunderstanding. We were heading toward a collision between authority and reality. And reality doesn't negotiate. The first real snowfall of the season arrived overnight, heavy and relentless, the kind that doesn't drift politely, but piles up with intent. I woke before my alarm to the muffled stillness that only comes when snow swallows sound. Streetlights cast a dull orange glow over untouched white, and I knew before stepping outside that the hill hadn't been touched. The school district hadn't announced a delay. Buses were coming. I stood at the window scrolling through the HOA emails again, as if reading them one more time might change what they said. No unauthorized snow clearing. The words felt absurd now, stripped of context and humanity. Snow didn't care about authorization. Gravity didn't care about bylaws. My spouse came into the kitchen, pulling on a sweater. "Are they coming?" they asked. "Yes," I said. "And the road isn't safe." I called the city first, because part of me still hoped someone official would step in and make this whole thing unnecessary. The dispatcher was polite and firm. "Private road. HOA responsibility. If there was an emergency, call 911. Until then, there was nothing they could do." So I called the plow driver we'd used the year before. He answered immediately, already on the road. I told him exactly what I needed, just the entrance and the hill, not the whole neighborhood, not driveways. 5 minutes of work to prevent a disaster. He paused, then asked the question I'd expected. "They still saying no?" "Wes!" Another pause. "I'll come take a look." By the time his truck's headlights cut through the falling snow, a few neighbors were already outside. No one was talking much. Everyone was watching the hill. The plow rolled toward the entrance slowly, blade raised, engine rumbling steady and calm. Relief washed through me, brief but real. Then I noticed the car. It was parked just inside the entrance, engine running. positioned carefully, not blocking aggressively, just close enough that the plow couldn't pass without risking contact. Inside sat a board member, windows up, heater on, phone in hand. The plow driver leaned out his window. "You expecting trouble?" Before I could answer, I walked over and knocked on the car window. It lowered a few inches. Warm air spilled out. "Sir," the board member said evenly, "are you an approved vendor for this association?" "No," the driver said. "I'm here to plow snow." The board member nodded, as if confirming something they already knew. "Then you're trespassing on private property. If your blade touches that asphalt, we'll pursue damages for unauthorized alteration of common elements. Your insurance carrier will be notified. Is this job worth your premium?" They raised the window back up and looked down at their phone. I stood there for a moment, waiting for more. There wasn't any. No yelling, no threats, just quiet certainty. I knocked again, harder this time. The board member didn't respond. They simply lifted one finger and pointed at the private property sign mounted beside the entrance, then went back to scrolling. The plow driver exhaled slowly. "I'm not losing my business over this," he said, already shifting into reverse. "I'm sorry." As the truck pulled away, I pulled out my phone and started recording. The parked car, the sign, the untouched snow, the time, the date. I narrated calmly, stating exactly what was happening and who was responsible. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. The board member never got out of their car. Within minutes, parents were gathering again. Phones up, voices low and angry. Someone asked if the HOA could really stop this. Someone else said they'd already tried calling the board and got voicemail. A mother pointed at the hill and said, "That bus is not making it down." The first bus appeared at the top of the slope not long after. It slowed, stopped, and stayed there. The driver didn't even attempt the descent. They radioed in, engine idling, hazard lights blinking against the white. That was when the HOA email came through. It said the roads were safe enough and reminded residents not to engage unauthorized vendors. The tone was professional, almost cheerful, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. As if a school bus hadn't just been forced to stop because adults were arguing over control. I replied immediately. Photos of the hill, screenshots of the city email stating the road was HOA responsibility, a short note explaining that buses were already unable to proceed. No accusation, just facts. There was no response. Parents started forwarding their own messages. One attached a video of their child crying on the bus. Another sent a photo of tire tracks sliding sideways near the curve. Silence from the board, standing there in the cold, watching snow continue to fall. The situation finally crystallized. This wasn't about confusion or delay. The board had made a choice. They had decided that maintaining authority mattered more than responding to reality, that enforcing rules mattered more than adapting when those rules failed. I checked the forecast again, hoping for something to soften the day. It was worse. More snow overnight, temperatures dropping, freezing rain expected after dark. I looked back up at the hill, at the stopped bus, at the parked car still idling near the entrance, and understood the stakes clearly for the first time. This wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was a test of whether safety could override control, and the people in charge had already chosen their side. By midday, the snow had stopped being snow and started becoming something worse. What fell earlier softened the ground, just enough for the temperature drop to turn everything slick. The road didn't look dramatic anymore. It looked deceptively calm, coated in a thin, glassy layer that sent cars sliding with the slightest turn of the wheel. I watched one neighbor try to back out of their driveway and give up halfway, tires spinning quietly in place. The HOA didn't respond with action. They responded with paperwork. Violation notices began appearing in inboxes before sunset, not for plowing, not even for treating the road, for shoveling. Anyone who had cleared snow away from the edges of the asphalt received a warning for unauthorized alteration of common elements. The language was neutral, almost polite, which somehow made it worse. One neighbor showed me theirs, hands shaking as they scrolled. The fine amount was listed clearly at the bottom, as if this were a routine offense. Parents started calling the school district directly. I did too again. The transportation office sounded strained. They told us buses would not attempt the hill unless conditions improved. They had already raised concerns with the HOA. Control of access rested with them. If the road wasn't safe, pickups would be delayed or canceled. When I asked what would happen if a bus got stuck, there was a pause. "That's what we're trying to avoid," the woman said quietly. I requested an emergency HOA meeting that night. Not a vote, not a demand, just a conversation before morning. I explained the ice, the forecast, the buses scheduled again at dawn. The reply came hours later, brief and dismissive. No emergency meeting was warranted. Instead, another message went out to the entire community accusing certain residents of spreading unnecessary alarm and undermining confidence in the association. Panic. That was the word they used, as if fear had appeared out of thin air, not grown from days of warnings being ignored. At home, the worry finally stopped being theoretical. My spouse sat at the table scrolling through photos from neighbors, each one worse than the last. "What if they get stuck again?" they asked. "What if it's colder tomorrow?" I didn't have an answer that would make either of us feel better. All I could promise was that I'd be outside in the morning, watching, ready to call for help if something went wrong. The words felt thin. As evening settled in, people talked in low voices near their driveways, careful not to be seen agreeing too openly. Everyone understood the risk now, but they also understood the cost of pushing back. Fines. Retaliation being labeled a problem. Fear spread faster than the ice. Then the headlights appeared at the entrance. A tow truck idled just past the sign, engine humming steadily. It wasn't there to help. The driver said he'd been told to stand by, just in case. No one asked what that meant. If someone blocked the road, if someone tried to plow again, if someone decided safety mattered more than compliance. That was the moment it stopped feeling like neglect and started feeling like enforcement. The forecast updated again before bed. More accumulation overnight, wind, temperatures dropping well below freezing. The kind of conditions where small mistakes turn serious fast. I tucked my kids in and lingered longer than usual, listening to their breathing, trying not to imagine worst-case scenarios. When I finally lay down, sleep refused to come. Every distant engine sounded like trouble. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. I knew buses were scheduled again in the morning. I knew the road would be worse, not better, and I knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in my chest, that the people with the power to stop this had already decided not to. As the night stretched on, one thought looped in my head, steady and unavoidable. By morning, something was going to break. Morning didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. After the second round of canceled pickups and frantic group messages from parents, I stopped trying to reason with the HOA and went around them. I called the school district's transportation supervisor directly, not the general office, not the automated line. When they answered, I could tell from their tone that I wasn't the first parent to reach out. I explained what had happened with the hill, the plow, the blocked entrance. There was a pause, then a quiet sigh. They told me something the board had never acknowledged publicly. The district had already filed multiple safety complaints about our neighborhood, not just from that week, but from earlier incidents as well. Each time a bus struggled, Each time a route was delayed or rerouted, it had been logged. Warnings had been sent. Recommendations made. None of it was new. That was the moment I realized the board hadn't been uninformed. They had been choosing. The supervisor gave me a second number and suggested I call it immediately. It belonged to the county emergency coordinator. I dialed it expecting resistance. Instead, I got someone who listened. I described the road layout, the single access point, the blocked plow, the ice. They pulled up records while we spoke and confirmed what I already suspected. The access road met the criteria for required emergency maintenance. Fire trucks and ambulances needed to be able to pass at all times, especially during predictable weather events. And snow is predictable here, they said. Matter of factly, I asked what happened when an HOA failed to maintain that access. The answer was precise and unsettling. It triggered documentation, reviews, and potentially insurance consequences. Most HOA policies required proof that emergency routes were kept passable. Repeated non-compliance didn't just create risk, it signaled disregard. That word stuck with me, disregard. I asked them to put everything in writing. They agreed without hesitation. When the call ended, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt focused. I opened my laptop and began pulling everything together. Emails sent. Emails ignored. The video of the board member's car parked at the entrance. Weather alerts. Screenshots from the city stating the road was HOA responsibility. I organized them by date and time, building a clean, factual timeline. No commentary, no exaggeration, just a record. Parents started reaching out once word spread that the district and county were involved. Quietly, carefully. Nobody wanted their name broadcast in another HOA message, but they were willing to write statements. Short ones at first, then longer. They described kids crying on buses, drivers refusing to attempt the hill, calls that went unanswered. I saved every one. Something shifted inside me as I worked. I stopped drafting emotional emails. I stopped asking for meetings that wouldn't happen. Instead, I started requesting records, confirmations, clarifications. When the board replied, I archived it. When they didn't, I documented that too. This wasn't about convincing them anymore. It was about making the facts impossible to ignore. By late afternoon, I had everything I needed. I drafted a formal notice requesting a complaint presentation, citing safety concerns and compliance requirements. I copied the school district and the county emergency office. The tone was calm, professional, and final. I didn't ask whether they would meet. I informed them that the matter was moving forward. When I hit send, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the snow started falling. Control. Not over the weather, not over the HOA, but over my own response. For the first time, we weren't reacting to their decisions or bracing for their next move. We were setting the terms. That evening, as the sky darkened again and the temperature dropped, my phone buzzed with a short reply from the board acknowledging receipt. No argument, no denial, just a confirmation. I closed my laptop and looked out at the hill, still slick and dangerous, but no longer ignored. The pleading was over. Planning had begun. Once the shift happened, everything became quieter and more deliberate. I didn't announce what I was doing, and I didn't warn anyone on the board. I simply paid attention. The security cameras we'd installed months earlier kept recording, and over the next 2 mornings they captured exactly what I expected and hoped I wouldn't see. Before dawn, a board member's car pulled up to the entrance and stopped in nearly the same position as before. Not blocking loudly, not confrontationally, just close enough to make access impossible. The engine stayed running. The driver never stepped out. Snow continued to fall. The road remained untouched. Each clip had a timestamp. Each clip showed the same thing: deliberate obstruction without a single word spoken. I downloaded the footage and labeled it carefully. Next came the weather data. Not forecasts, not news headlines, the raw reports. Accumulation totals. Freeze warnings. Historical averages showing this wasn't an anomaly or a freak storm. This was normal winter weather for our area, the kind everyone planned for except the people who were supposed to. When I lined the reports up next to the ignored emails and warnings, a pattern emerged that was hard to explain away as coincidence. Parents sent their statements in quietly, usually late at night. No dramatics, just facts. One described watching the bus stop halfway up the hill, hazard lights blinking. Another wrote about their child asking if the bus was going to slide again. A third admitted they were afraid to speak publicly, but didn't want their silence to be mistaken for agreement. I kept every statement exactly as written, no edits, no commentary. The county emergency coordinator followed through as promised. They sent documentation confirming that the access road qualified as a required emergency route and that repeated failures had been logged. The language was careful and professional, but the meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a record of noncompliance. That was when the HOA resurfaced. An announcement went out declaring a special meeting to address what the board called ongoing disruption and unauthorized activity. The phrasing was familiar by now, passive, polished, and pointed. They weren't backing down. They were preparing to reassert authority, and from the tone, they believed the threat of consequences would bring everyone back into line. Reading it, I felt something close to relief. Overconfidence has a way of making people careless. I spent the rest of the day assembling everything into a single, clean timeline. No emotional framing, no speculation, just a sequence of events that spoke for itself. Warnings sent, responses ignored, actions taken, conditions worsened, obstruction documented. I shared the file with the school district and confirmed the emergency coordinator would attend the meeting virtually. They agreed without hesitation. The board didn't know any of that. Instead, they sent a follow-up agenda for the meeting. Buried midway through was the real objective, a proposed vote to fine residents involved in unauthorized snow removal attempts and interference with HOA operations. Names weren't listed, but everyone knew who was being targeted. The intent wasn't correction. It was intimidation. I read the agenda twice, then closed my laptop. Outside, the road was finally clear after days of outside pressure, scraped and sanded enough to function. It struck me as almost ironic. The board had spent so much effort resisting help, and now help had arrived anyway, just not on their terms. That night, I double-checked every file, every video, every timestamp. I made backups and shared access with people who didn't have a stake in HOA politics. I didn't need drama. I needed accuracy. The vote was scheduled for the following evening. They thought they were calling the community to order. They didn't realize they'd just scheduled the moment everything would come apart. Not because of emotion, not because of panic, but because the facts were finally going to be placed where they couldn't be ignored. The meeting room filled slowly, but the tension was already there when I walked in. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was controlled, tight, the kind of atmosphere where people choose their seats carefully and keep their voices low. Folding chairs lined up in uneven rows. Neighbors clustered in small groups, whispering, then falling silent when a board member looked their way. I took a seat near the back and kept my phone in my pocket. The board opened the meeting exactly the way they always did. With procedure, approval of minutes, a brief recap of recent disruptions, carefully chosen words that framed the last few days as an inconvenience rather than a risk. When finances came up, the board leader leaned into the microphone and spoke calmly about liability, reserve funds, and the importance of consistency. They talked as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if no buses had been turned away, and no parents had stood in the cold watching their kids get stranded. When someone from the audience mentioned the hill, the board leader sighed, not dramatically, just enough to signal annoyance. "We've addressed this already," they said. The conditions were within acceptable limits. What made the situation worse was unnecessary alarm. A few heads nodded. Others stayed still. They shifted quickly to the real issue: unauthorized actions, interference, residents taking matters into their own hands and exposing the association to risk. The board leader spoke like a manager delivering a performance review, not like someone discussing children and ice. They made it sound reasonable, responsible, necessary. I stayed silent. That seemed to unsettle them more than shouting ever could. They wanted a reaction. They wanted someone to interrupt so they could restore order and prove a point. When it didn't happen, the board leader glanced in my direction, then looked back down at their notes. They said safety concerns had been exaggerated, that no emergency vehicles had been blocked, that the association had remained compliant throughout the storm. The confidence in their voice was practiced, absolute. I felt a few parents shift in their seats. One whispered, "That's not true." Another shook their head slowly. The board leader smiled tightly. "We can't govern based on fear," they said. "We govern based on policy." Then they announced the motion: a vote to fine residents involved in unauthorized snow removal attempts or actions that interfered with HOA operations. The language was broad on purpose, flexible. It didn't need names. Everyone knew who it applied to. The room felt smaller all at once. They explained the fines calmly, almost apologetically, as if this were an unfortunate necessity rather than a choice. "This is about restoring order," the board leader said. "If we allow exceptions, we lose control. Control, not safety, not responsibility, control." They asked if there was any discussion before the vote. For a moment, no one spoke. People looked down, looked away. The silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable. That was when I stood. I didn't rush. I didn't speak yet. Chairs creaked, heads turned. The board leader looked up, irritation flashing briefly across their face. "Please sit down," they said. "You'll have an opportunity after the vote." I shook my head once. "No," I said evenly. Before. There was a murmur in the room. The board leader leaned toward the microphone. "You're out of order." "Then note it," I replied. "Because this needs to be on the record." They hesitated, just for a second. Long enough for the room to realize something was different. The board leader straightened their papers, clearly deciding whether to shut me down or let me speak. Confidence flickered into calculation. I took one step forward. "Just to be clear," I said, keeping my voice steady, "the board's position is that the current road conditions were compliant with county emergency access requirements." The board leader didn't consult anyone. They answered immediately. "Yes," they said, "we were fully compliant." A few people gasped quietly. I nodded once, like I'd been waiting for that exact response. My hand tightened around my phone as I turned toward the screen at the front of the room. "Okay," I said, and as the board leader opened their mouth to call the vote, I tapped the screen and brought the next voice into the room, one they hadn't planned for and couldn't ignore. The screen lit up before anyone could stop it. The county emergency coordinator appeared, framed by a plain office wall, glasses on, a stack of files open in front of them. Their voice was calm, even the kind of tone that didn't argue because it didn't need to. "That statement is incorrect," they said. "I have the compliance log here." The room went still. Not quiet, still. The kind of silence that hurts your ears. They began reading from the record. Dates, times, weather conditions. Notices sent to the HOA warning that emergency access requirements were not being met. Each entry landed heavier than the last because there was no emotion in it. No accusation, just documentation. I stepped slightly to the side and let the screen do the work when the coordinator mentioned deliberate obstruction of private snow removal. A ripple went through the room, heads turned toward the board. One member leaned in to whisper something, but the board leader raised a hand without looking at them, as if trying to maintain control through muscle memory alone. I picked up the folder and opened it slowly. "I want to read one section of the association's insurance policy," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't rush. I lowered my voice instead. "Please listen to the wording." I read it almost in a whisper. Immediate. Policy? Pause. None. Renewal. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. I explained that the district and county had been copied earlier that day, and that this letter, printed on official letterhead, was the response. The policy was under active review due to documented non-compliance and exposure risk. Continued failure to maintain emergency access would result in termination of coverage. That was when the room broke. Parents started talking at once, not shouting, questioning, demanding explanations, asking how long the board had known, asking why warnings were ignored. Someone stood up and said they had emailed weeks ago and never received a reply. Another parent said they had been fined for shoveling ice away from a curve. The board members huddled, voices low and urgent now, papers sliding across the table. The confidence they'd walked in with evaporated in real time. One of them tried to call for order, but their voice cracked, and no one listened. The motion to fine residents was never officially withdrawn. It didn't need to be. No one seconded it. No one wanted to touch it. It sat there, unfinished, like a sentence that no longer made sense. The board leader stood up slowly. They didn't look angry. They looked tired, cornered. They cleared their throat and said they were resigning, effective immediately. No justification, no defense, just a statement delivered flatly before they gathered their papers and left through the side door. The room watched them go without a word. I didn't tell anyone that I had already texted the plow driver 10 minutes earlier. When I saw the color drain from the board leader's face. "Start the engines," I'd written. "We're done here." By the time the meeting dissolved and people stepped outside, the proof was already there. Headlights at the entrance. Engines rumbling. Blades down. Snow flying in wide, controlled arcs as the hill was cleared properly for the first time since the storm began. No applause at first. Just people standing there watching, breathing again. Then someone clapped once, another followed. Not celebration, relief. The road was open. And the power that had kept it closed was gone. The difference the next morning was impossible to miss. The road was clear before sunrise, not just scraped, but properly treated. Sand in the curves. Salt where ice always formed. The hill that had trapped buses and terrified parents days earlier was wet pavement now, dark and ordinary. Emergency vehicles could pass without hesitation. School buses rolled in on schedule, climbed the slope smoothly, and eased back down like this had never been a question in the first place. Drivers waved. Kids pressed their faces to the windows, excited again instead of scared. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was administrative, and that's what made it stick. An interim HOA leadership group was announced within days. No speeches, no grand resets, just a written notice outlining immediate priorities, documented winter maintenance, emergency access compliance, and clear communication with the school district and county. The tone was different, less polished, more direct. Safety wasn't framed as a liability anymore. It was framed as a responsibility. The insurance issue was addressed quietly but firmly. Compliance reports were filed. Maintenance schedules were submitted. Coverage was confirmed to continue as long as the new procedures were followed. Everything that had once been vague and deniable was now written down, tracked, and visible. Authority didn't disappear. It was boxed in by accountability. What surprised me most were the private moments. Neighbors stopped me during evening walks, in parking lots, at the bus stop. They didn't make announcements. They didn't want attention. They just said thank you. Some admitted they'd been afraid to speak up. Others apologized for staying silent. I told them the truth. I understood. Fear works best when it's quiet, and the HOA had relied on that. At home, the tension slowly drained away. Mornings returned to routine. The sound of the bus became background noise again instead of a trigger for dread. My kids stopped asking if the road would be icy or if the bus would get stuck. I stopped checking weather alerts like they were emergency warnings. Looking back, the story isn't really about snow or bylaws or insurance clauses. It's about what happens when rules are treated as more important than the people they're meant to serve, and what happens when ordinary parents decide that safety isn't negotiable, even when authority says otherwise. I didn't set out to confront an HOA. I didn't want meetings or evidence folders or tense silences. I wanted kids to get to school without fear. That was it. Everything else unfolded because that simple expectation was treated like a threat. The community feels different now. Not perfect, not suddenly unified, but more honest. Questions get answered. Concerns are discussed before they turn into crises. Winter plans are reviewed early instead of ignored until something goes wrong. It's quieter, not because people are afraid to speak, but because fewer people need to. Sometimes I still think about how close we came to something far worse, and how easily it could have been avoided if someone in power had listened instead of enforced. That's the part that stays with me. Not the confrontation, not the resignation, but the reminder that silence and indifference can be just as dangerous as bad decisions. Home is supposed to be the place where you feel protected. For a while, ours wasn't. Now it is again. Not because authority tightened its grip, but because it was finally forced to answer to reality. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?